Surrey is a programme of engagement. It's designed to knit together a local natural capital market in Surrey. The programme will start with a series of 3 webinars, which will feature representatives from farming, local government, and our local communities, who will share their current work, their visions and their targets for the future of Surrey's landscape. With this context, we'll then bring together all stakeholders into roundtable conversations and workshops to develop an aligned strategy and co-create projects which will regenerate Surrey's natural and farmed environments. We've got representatives from farming and land management, ENGOs, local universities, local governments and statutory bodies such as Natural England and the Environment Agency. We have utility companies and also community groups. This representation is absolutely essential to the Regenerative Surrey approach, where we aim to achieve integrated, collaborative, systemic and transformative ways of working. To do this, all parts of the system need to be involved to solve the puzzle together.
I've been working in Surrey now for over 20 years, looking at how we can develop a systemic approach to caring for our natural environment. And I'm really excited about the Regenerative Surrey opportunity to take that to the next level. And I always find it's really worth reminding us why this is a really good moment for us to do that, because we are in the midst of 4 different crises. And those of you who might have heard me say this before, I don't apologise for saying it again, because it's really important that we remember the urgency of coming together to take positive action to address these crises. But not to paint too black a picture on it, we actually do know what the solutions are. So if we come together, I'm a real believer that we can actually implement the solutions we need. We know in Surrey that we've lost over 1/3 of our species. They're either extinct or in decline. We also know that we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change with events such as wildfires on 2 of our national nature reserves last year, one of which required residents to be evacuated. We've also seen over the last 18 months how important the natural environment is to our well-being, but we recognise that for many, access to that green space, which is so important for all of us, is very varied, and there are many parts of the community which are not able to access green space in the way that we would like. And finally, we recognise that our resilience as a society, socially and economically, is very dependent on the health of our natural environment. But addressing these problems actually provides us with an opportunity to put something better back in place. And that's what we're trying to do with the Regenerative Surrey approach. One of the most important aspects from my point of view is that we do this together. We have a lot of legislation coming through. We have a range of different people involved in developing policies and approaches. And all of these things have a place and a value in developing a restorative approach to Surrey. I think we should be ambitious, but I think we should be ambitious together.
So let's just start with defining natural capital, because I do think it's a term that is frequently bandied around, but can often become confused or misunderstood. Essentially, it's everything that makes up natural ecosystems, from air to water to rock. It's most commonly defined as the world's stock of natural resources. And this diagram here at the bottom of the slide demonstrates that stocks of natural capital deliver flows of ecosystem services which hold a value to society. And I'm sure you all know this, but examples of ecosystem services, we're looking at carbon sequestration, we're looking at biodiversity uplift, water provision, public health benefits from public access, etc., etc. The list goes on. But these natural assets and their ecosystem services have not typically been recorded on balance sheets at either national or business level, which has led to them being undervalued in financial decision making. However, as society and business increasingly realise the value of ecosystem services in combating climate change, restoring nature, reducing pollution and supporting societal well-being, there are income opportunities and incentives for the land managers that can provide these services.
We've been working on a natural capital approach now in Surrey for nearly 10 years. And what this does is it recognises the importance of our natural environment to provide us with a range of services, whether that's climate regulation or flood regulation, whether it's the provision of raw materials such as timber, or whether it's those cultural services, the ability to go for a walk and restore our well-being. All of these things are services which we've relied on for many years without necessarily recognising that they need to be maintained. And the natural capital approach is all about understanding that where we are at the moment is that stock, if you like, of our natural assets has been in decline for many years and continues to be in decline. And we rely for our resilience very heavily on the services that natural asset provides for us. So it's really important that we actually improve the assets, improve our natural environment, and also, very importantly, maintain it into the long term. And that's what the Natural Capital Investment Plan for Surrey, published in 2018, sets out to do, sets out a plan for how we do that. And nature-based solutions are a very good mechanism for delivering that.
So very simply, kind of coming back to what do I feel is the thing that's going to really enable us to generate this sort of regenerative Surrey approach and help us push together. So really very simply, it comes down to we need to choose a direction together. This is about us coming together, choosing how we want to contribute to our natural environment, piloting different projects in different parts of the county so we can demonstrate what works and what doesn't, make sure we're learning what we're doing, and then we're aligning and going again. So we're continually improving the mechanisms that we're using to enhance nature. And this can really be a bottom up. So farmers, landowners, contributing what they want to put into this natural capital market, more hedges, more trees, more wildflower meadows, as well as top down incentives. So maybe there are, maybe there are more opportunities for connectivity, as Sarah Jane just shared about, that we could say, well, actually, if 5 farmers were to build more hedgerows or shelter belts, that would create connectivity through that landscape. So we can have this sort of bottom up and top down approach where we have all stakeholders engaged. And really the whole point is we want to ensure that everyone is involved, the whole value chain, whether it's Network Rail, whether it's funders, investors, whether it's the farmers, farming groups, local communities, smallholders, local public, everyone engaged in this kind of this direction of travel that we're all going on together. So that's really what we're here to enable and the possibility we're looking to open up. And just coming to a bit of a close, really this comes, I guess, from the philosophy of thinking globally. As Sarah Jane said, we've got these massive global crises that we're all walking into at the moment, whether we like it or not, but we have to act locally. And really, I think, we do have all that we need to resolve the greatest global challenges that we all face together. But we just need to come together as one to work towards creating a prosperous planet for future generations. So that's really everything that underpins what we're trying to do and what we're here to enable.
When I first started to work at Surrey last year, one of the first things that I was given was a target which scared the life out of me, which was planting 1.6 million trees in Surrey, which is perhaps the most wooded county in the country, although Kent, where I'm from, it would dispute that. So planting 1.6 million trees in Surrey is quite a challenge. So I immediately tried to broaden that out to look at how we look at other environments, other habitats, other ways of capturing carbon and linking things up, which then brings you into the whole discussion around what people want out of the land. So you've got people wanting to plant trees, you've got people wanting to conserve biodiversity, you've got carbon sequestration, you've got renewables, you've got access and enjoyment. And all of a sudden you can see that we've got a lot of green space, a lot of natural capital and a lot of people that want to use it. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to make sure we looked at developing a framework, not a strategy, a framework that allowed us to link all those different aspects and all those different benefits and pots of money together to be able to get a cohesive approach. So that was how I came in to this. Just a quick plug for where that framework fits in. It's a key part of Surrey's climate change strategy. That was launched in May last year, and it commits Surrey as a county and all the local authorities within it, plus also Surrey County Council, to some really stretching targets around net zero, hitting net zero for Surrey County Council by 2030 and the county as a whole by 2050. So it has some really challenging targets within that, and we're currently developing the delivery plan for that. Obviously, a lot of what's made up in that delivery plan will come from things like making heating improvements and reducing emissions from transport and travel. But a key aspect will also be around how we interact with and how we manage our natural and green environment. And a much maligned phrase around offsetting, natural capital and offsetting, but it's something that I really want to challenge and see how we can combine what we need to do with carbon to really take a very, very positive approach to habitat creation and habitat and land protection and management there as well. So we get a meaningful approach to offsetting. Natural capital is incredibly high on the agenda at the minute. I thought it would go down in priorities as a county council, but it's actually increased, and COVID has meant that that's increased even more. We've obviously got the obvious things of the government's 30 by 30, the carbon sequestration that we've talked about, but the Environment Bill coming forward is going to change things quite considerably in how we interact with and manage the natural environment. And biodiversity net gain is definitely something that us as a county and our district authorities that we very much partner with are trying to grapple and see how we address and linking that very positively to nature recovery networks. But there's a whole other driver about how we can use natural capital to benefit residents, to get those really positive outcomes around health and well-being, but also economy and training as well. So there's lots and lots of positive drivers and legislative drivers, and there's actually quite a lot of pots of money. But what the issue is with that is that there are lots of different pots of money, all with different rules and regulations, small pots, big pots, and they all link. And we have to try and find a way of both linking the drivers, linking what people want to do with the different pots of money and getting a really cohesive approach. As I said, there's lots of money, there's lots of organisations, lots of activity, often going in the same direction, but quite often they're not going in the same direction or slightly different. So the progress that we're making, is it maximised and is it enough? So what I want to move towards, and the way of working, is that we bring all that together so that we have a combined joint approach that recognises differences, recognises the complexities, but helps us to move forward in a much more coordinated fashion and getting much better outcomes. So the framework that I'm proposing and developing with colleagues, which is in its early stages, is, as I said, it's not a strategy, it's a framework. There are an awful lot of plans and action plans and strategies coming forward that look at things to do with the natural environment and natural capital. So this is about how do we hang those together to look at where we need to make sure there's no real conflict. So we don't want to plant trees on chalk downlands. We want to recognise where we've got really special areas of biodiversity that need to be completely protected and left alone. But we also need to link up where we can link up those strategies. So if we're developing natural flood risk management and looking at where we get flooded, how can we link that up with biodiversity, with carbon, with access and pathways and cycling? How can we link that all together when we can? So that's what it's about. It's about linking the different strategies, and those strategies I put on here are just a selection. There are lots more, and it's about how we link those together. So where are we in that process? Well, we're very much at the evidence base at the minute. We're looking at what we've got in terms of assets across Surrey, not just on public sector land, but also trying to engage and move forward with what's not on public sector land, to try and make an assessment of what those benefits and services are, and then start to layer that up, both with where we've got issues and problems, but where there's opportunities. So where we might have congestion issues or poor areas of air quality, or where we might have areas where there's not much green space and we can create more. So it's really making that strategy link up and really overlaying those opportunities and challenges so we can see where the sweet stroke hotspots are. And then moving later to get a pipeline of projects or bringing projects together to aggregate projects so we can start to use that to be in a position when government comes out with pots of money that sometimes don't have very long lead-in times, or when there's other avenues of opportunity, we've got those projects ready to invest in. That's just to give you, this slide's just to give you an idea of the type of work that's ongoing, the type of research that we've already, and data that is already ongoing and we're collecting and bringing together. Some of it Sarah Jane's referred to. They did some natural capital accounting a couple of years ago. We've now taken that and taken it from just one side of the county to covering the whole of the county, but also urban biodiversity opportunity areas, as well as identifying where we can plant trees and bringing those different bits of work together, as well as working with our district colleagues with what they're doing at a local level and feeding that in as well. So we've got a really, really comprehensive database that's forever improving as we go forward. And lastly, the last bit of work in this current bit of work is around, as I said, the natural capital accounting. So really looking at where those wider benefits are. And a lot of those wider benefits benefit the public. So and wider society. So how do we access those benefits? So just to round up, next steps for us is to continue the engagement around this. We've done work with our local district colleagues. We've done work with the Wildlife Trust, and we're starting to go out and talk to a lot more people to have an approach where we as those people working in the countryside, working in natural environment, and that's not just in the countryside, that's in urban areas as well. How do we come together as organisations and really have a one Surrey countryside approach?
So today, the collaborative multi-stakeholder approach, I believe, is going to be demonstrated as we mesh together a conversation that strives to move us towards nature-based solutions. And certainly in the conversations around the agriculture sector, that's where the nature-based solutions can be offered and developed on the very large scale.
There are a lot of different policies, as you can see from this slide, hence why it's titled A Pandora's Box. I'm going to start with the Ag Act. So post-Brexit, the UK is facing a massive policy shift in terms of agricultural support. As we know, over the next 7 years, BPS and countryside stewardship will be replaced with a new support system of payments for public goods or ecosystem services. And this is called Environmental Land Management, or ELM. It's a big change in what farmers are going to be paid for as compared to BPS. And I think the key thing to remember here is that there's definitely not going to be as much money available for farmers as previously has been under cap. So that's the Ag Act. Moving on to trade policy, we've got the trade bill and future trade deals. They will certainly have an impact on certain elements of agri-food supply chains. There's a lot of opportunities for investment there when we're looking at future export markets, but there are also potential threats, particularly in relation to the thorny issue of trading standards. So then we've got the Environment Bill, which will also have a significant impact on rural land use. In here, we have the introduction of the polluter pays principle, which will mean that landowners have to mitigate any pollution risks they have, which will likely result in an investment in the environmental resilience of their land. But then we have a huge opportunity as well through the Environment Bill, and that's through the introduction of mandatory biodiversity net gain. and that's going to be for all future development, which will generate a market in off-site biodiversity unit creation, which will provide new income opportunities for land managers. And then in the middle there, we've got the National Food Strategy. So that's Henry Dimbleby's. There are some really interesting proposals in there. I think one to be particularly aware of is the three-way rural land use split that has been proposed between land for nature restoration, land for regenerative agriculture, and land for high-yielding calorific production. Another headlining proposal in there is the 30% reduction in meat consumption. So what this strategy does is it proposes some really big shifts or acrobatics in land use, which speak to mainstreaming natural capital thinking whilst continuing to grow nutritious food. And finally, down the bottom, we've got the mothership that is climate policy. So we know the target is net zero by 2050 for the UK, which is globally one of the most ambitious targets. But there is a big policy gap that we're currently facing in terms of reaching that target. And I think how that will happen is as of yet quite unknown. Rural land is both the problem and the solution in the face of carbon emissions. We're likely to see both incentives and increasing regulation. So not only is there a huge diversity of policy that impacts the rural sector, providing opportunities for natural capital investment, but I also want to make the point that within these policies, there is a very fine line between increasing opportunities and an increasing regulatory baseline. So it's very much a carrot and stick situation, and we're trying to navigate our way through at the moment to see which will have more of an impetus. However, it's not just about policy. In fact, public funding pales into significance when we look at the opportunities that the private market can provide. But increasing requirements for business accountability, so whether that's through the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure or the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, mean that business is starting to take this seriously, and this is creating significant opportunities for rural land managers. So, for example, we're seeing more and more retailers and producers within agri-food supply chains committing to net zero. Morrisons and McCain are two companies who've made announcements recently, and suddenly the ability to provide offsets and manage a farm's natural capital for environmental benefits becomes part of legitimizing a farmer's market access. But not only that, we're also seeing the demand for ecosystem service in private markets grow rapidly. So an example here that I'm sure everyone has heard about is the demand for voluntary carbon offsets. The global demand for nature-based voluntary carbon offsets increased 30% in 2018, and the task in 2019, sorry, as compared to 2018. And the Task Force on Scaling Up Voluntary Carbon Markets reported that to meaningfully achieve the Paris Agreement, voluntary carbon markets need to grow by at least 15 times by 2030. So that's an enormous amount of scaling that we need to see. I think it's really interesting that policy is working to drive these private markets. We can look at things like the Woodland Carbon Guarantee or the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which are examples of public funding to generate the development of private marketplaces. Arguably, the opportunity within these markets has more potential than relying on the dwindling public purse.
Countryside stewardship and agri-environment schemes are essentially looking at building natural capital, and it is a market, it's a publicly funded market for environmental delivery, which is something that most farmers have engaged in to some extent. But that has broadened out recently. There are some of the private sector organisations are coming into the marketplace. So the water companies were one of the first businesses to start getting involved, looking at how they can protect water quality by working with farmers and getting them to do certain actions, whether that's fencing off water courses or reducing pesticide applications, so that they've got less of a need to put in heavy engineering and expensive filters into their water treatment works. Similarly, we've Molly mentioned biodiversity net gain before. There's the principles of biodiversity net gain have been around for quite some time as a voluntary approach. What's changing is that that's going to become mandatory through the Environment Bill. And I think that will be quite a game changer in the way we approach by improving habitats, and a huge opportunity for landowners. There's also the market end of natural capital, where there are certain standards that actually drive natural capital, drive the building of natural capital in the supply chain, and LEAF would be one example of that. And then finally, social prescribing. This is an area, there's been a couple of trials of this about how GPs can recommend going out into the countryside often under protected and managed situations and paid for situations in order to improve mental health and physical health as well. And it's very easy to head to the public sector funding and the comfort zone of agri-environment schemes rather than thinking more broadly about it. So just summarising on the market opportunities, there are three main bundles, if you like. So there's the public funding, which is in the future, it's primarily going to be the Environmental Land Management Scheme. That's going to be the main source of funding. It is going to take up the bulk of the current agriculture budget. Will be switching away from the direct payments to landowners into the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And it's not an insignificant marketplace. There will be a significant amount of funding going through that route. But there's also the regulatory drivers. We've mentioned biodiversity net gain. There's also carbon offsets, where there's funding coming from cap and trade systems that will be going into offsetting carbon, which will either be through mainly through tree planting. And of course, there's the developing voluntary market. And I think that is where we're getting into some really interesting territory, where people are being driven by their environmental, social and governance requirements to do something in driving up and helping in natural capital. And I think that's an area where, particularly when you're looking at a local situation, there could well be businesses that want to invest in local, have something physical and tangible and multifaceted. So it's not just about offsetting carbon. You might also be getting biodiversity benefits and something physical that you could take your employees out to have a look at and to have work away days, and really something that can benefit the local community as well. And I think that is becoming more important. So there are some barriers to getting into these markets. One in particular is around governance in particular. So looking at the standards and the accreditation and the verification. Now we've got the Woodland Carbon Code, and in peatland there's the Peatland Carbon Code. And both of those set an agreed standard of what is required. There's an agreed methodology of verification. So the market is underpinned. There's a bit of confidence. It's not perfect, but it can be evolved over time. But at least it is a starting point that everybody understands what's required of them, what will happen if it goes wrong, and you can then plan to how to address those. But without that, many of the other markets are struggling really to get a foothold. There's also quite high market entry cost potentially. They don't have to be high, but I think there's a fear that that they are high. Many businesses larger businesses have started to map their natural capital on their farm, and there are some very sophisticated and very impressive mapping and valuations that I've seen. There is a low entry or a low cost entry that can be achieved as well, and I think what we want to do is try and find that the appropriate level of mapping and assessing what your natural assets are on the landowner's business, without having to spend masses of money, which is a barrier to many people. There's also a barrier around the skills and knowledge, this confidence piece. And I think that's, at the moment, I think that's where we are. There feels like there's too many things swirling around, too many plates spinning, and not quite sure which way to jump. We know that there's the new Environmental Land Management Scheme is coming through, but it's not going to be fully there for another 3 years. There are people knocking on your door wanting to buy carbon if you're going to plant trees. There are offers for carbon sequestered in soil management, but there's lots of noise around that as well, that's not so permanent, and is that really credible? So it's not surprising that there is a bit of nervousness and lack of confidence in the market. One of the other issues is that if Morrison's and Waitrose are going to require a business to be net zero, then do you have to be net zero yourself before you can offset for anybody else? So there's some really tricky issues that need to be resolved and clarity given before the majority of people will feel really confident in these markets. The other thing is about finding a credible market at an appropriate scale. So you might have a small holding, a small farm, you know, with wanting to do some really great work on water, creation of some water habitat. But for many markets, unless it's at a large scale, they're just not interested. So it's about finding the appropriate scale. And again, I think that's where Regenerative Surrey could come into play, to be finding things that are suitable for the local markets. Then also there's the understanding risk. I mean, most landowners are quite adept at dealing with these sorts of risks about the contracts, the market variation, and the physical delivery. But when it comes to something that is maybe less tangible than a ton of wheat, you're actually looking at a ton of carbon or the appearance of certain wildlife, then it becomes a little bit uncertain. And this, again, there's a confidence aspect, but it's clear that we could understand the risk. And there are some products coming on the market to help deal with that risk as well now. Collaboration, there has been a nervousness around the collaboration word in landowners in the past, and for whatever reason we're pigeonholed as a country who doesn't collaborate. I actually don't think that's true. I think that's about the definition of collaboration, and if you open it up into sharing labour, sharing a bit of machinery, you know, going to discussion groups, there's a huge amount of collaboration on knowledge and equipment and skills. And I think it isn't a far step to then start thinking about collaboration at a wider scale for delivery of larger scale projects. Having said that, there is a real feel about autonomy and independence. So we need to find a way that collaboration can take place without losing that autonomy and independence of the business itself. And then finally, there's the tax implications, which are not insignificant, but they're potentially not insignificant, they're potentially very good. The trouble is, we don't know. There's no clarity on how some of these new schemes will affect tax situation of any business. And that at the moment, it's the lack of clarity that is the barrier.
We're looking to develop something called EnviroBench. Most of you will not come across this as a sort of tool that you will interact with day to day. But what we want it to do is connect up to existing tool providers out there and existing on-farm enterprise tools to enable you to obtain a carbon footprint and also to look at the trade-offs between carbon and nitrogen. Now, why EnviroBench is really important is that we want it to be the gold standard that provides a robust evidence-based carbon and nitrogen number for you. And then we're going to underpin this because what we envisage is that, you know, at these three levels, farmers and growers may come out and want to know, well, I'd like to do X, Y, and Z. So how do I go about doing that? So we've been developing the what works for agriculture, and I'll just show you a little bit about that in a moment. So very quickly, in terms of the what works for agriculture, we want to help farmers very quickly answer these three questions. What can I do to reduce the carbon footprint? Does it work on my farm? And how can I do it well? And at the moment, what we've done is to develop this What Works Centre, very much focused on net zero, but the longer term goal is to scale it up and cover absolutely all activities that you know, land managers need to cover, including net gain, biodiversity, economics, and so on. Basically, what as a sort of a farmer coming to this, you would be looking at a number of practices, and we've got a search capability that gets you here very quickly, or you can come to it via Google. You can then see, you know, well, I can lower age at first calving, and the outcomes are it reduces methane, it reduces the number of young stock on farm, and therefore that's linked very much to profit and productivity. And you can see it reduces cost. And we give some indication of what the cost of change is to deliver some of these sort of outcomes. We're very clear about where they work. Is it effective, or when not the jury's out in terms of effectiveness? So for example, biostimulants, it clearly shows that, you know, there can be variable outcomes. We look at speed of change. Is this something you can deliver in less than a year, 2 years, or maybe it's something you can deliver for your grandchildren? And then the strength of evidence is looking at, is it based on lots of well-replicated sort of research, or is it just one sample and therefore not very robust? But most importantly, we want to be able to capture from farmers, land managers, etc. Does this really work in the real world? And if it doesn't, then it gets a lower score. So we've got very robust standards that sit behind this. And the idea is that you can almost use some filters like you would for your TripAdvisor holiday booking, and get to this information very quickly. And at the moment, the markets are not very mature. And we heard earlier that the carbon code for woodland and the peatland code are about the best that there are out there in terms of being very transparent and very robust. But without that equivalence across the board, companies are just going to hold on to their money. And to be honest, I think at the moment, the prices that are being offered for many of these schemes are probably a bit on the low side compared to where the mandatory trading market is. And again, that partly reflects the lack of standards, the lack of confidence, the lack of liquidity, but it also shows that there's a lack of maturity in the market. We also want to make sure that however, money for both carbon offsetting and natural capital net gain is paid, it should be done with stacking or bundling so that you receive the benefits for the goods and services that you are delivering. What we don't want to see is the piggybacking model that is shown on the left-hand side, where basically carbon becomes the de facto sort of measure for all things environmental. And that goes also not just for carbon trading, but also for the produce that farmers grow. It needs to be all-encompassing and go wider than just carbon. So whilst I've spent a lot of time talking about carbon, we are very much aware that we need to talk about the total environment, the total environmental benefits, the risks, but also looking at some of these opportunities.
In today's webinar, we will explore how local governments can play a role in the way land is managed in Surrey and how they can work with local communities to coordinate environmental strategy. We will also explore the work of community groups who engage with Surrey's natural spaces and seek to understand their land management priorities. Our first speaker is Paul Brewer of Ada Worthing Council, and he'll kick us off and provide us a case study from Sussex, which provides an example of how a council can work with local communities to formulate a climate action plan.
We have a strategic approach called Sustainable AW, and it covers a whole variety of thematic areas that we are driving progress on, including biodiversity and nature restoration. It's been developed over the last few years, and we've done a few engagement exercises with the community to co-produce it, to build it together. We had a conference called Zero 2030 in March last year, just before the first lockdown, and we had about 300 people come along to look at carbon emissions reduction as a whole group. And from that, we've built a number of initiatives, which I'll go into a little bit. But one of the outcomes was to actually undertake a full citizens assembly, a climate assembly, which was a proper sort of democratic process of selecting 43 people in a balanced way from the community to talk about what their priorities were for sustainability. And some of the work that I'll show you comes directly from recommendations from that assembly. Like many organizations, we're aiming to be carbon neutral by 2030. We've adopted a area-wide target for net zero for 2045 for the area. But we do have a real kind of focus on a number of things, and particularly biodiversity and nature restoration, which is the main thrust of this presentation. That was our the sort of final day of our climate assembly, which was all online. Adrian Worthing are really always thinking about delivering outcomes at different levels, really. So organisationally delivering outcomes. So, for example, our carbon reduction plan identifies our strategic programme for reducing our carbon emissions, but also for investment in renewables and carbon offsetting as part of that package. So we're always thinking about organisational level, but we tend to also think about how we deliver value more broadly and create things which other people can tap into, if you like, sort of shared infrastructure and shared ideas. And we've bought 2 bits of land there to not only secure it as green space, but to restore it to more natural habitats. But we're thinking of these 2 bits of land as, if you like, demonstrators for how financing nature restoration could work in the future. So, you know, how might we use land that we own, whether it's a council or another landowner, and create, if you like, an inquiry about how to attract blended finance to it. So not just thinking about one thing, although that might be a good place to start, but you would imagine that capital and revenue funding models need to be created where you've got multiple income streams being applied. At Pad Farm, for example, we're going to need to unlock some significant capital funding from the Environment Agency to realign the embankment and to get a chance to restore salt marsh and mudflat habitat. So you need capital funding sometimes, and then to think forward to revenue funding too. And of course, for us as a council, we've acquired these bits of land, and New Salts Farm was £925,000 and Pad Farm was 324. We've also acquired another piece of land at the foot of Sisbury Ring, chalk grassland, which is 100 acres. How can those 3 bits of land be used? How can we start to understand how the money works, but also share that journey with landowners locally, so that they can think through how they as landowners can do something similar, bearing in mind that they would want to keep farming the land as well. So demonstrators that people can learn from. We would like the Ada River system to, you know, for Pad Farm to be the beginning of something which extends north, and engaging with landowners will be obviously really crucial for that. So really a perspective of the future of farming, but with the local authority leaning into that conversation and helping create networks where that conversation can be had. The funding strategies, just to reiterate really, that we're looking at, I think each bit of land and each restoration plan will mean that the funding strategies differ and are relatively unique to the site. So at New Salts Farm, we're working with the Rivers Trust locally to develop a project which may attract Heritage Lottery funding, as well as potentially on the back end ELMS payments to support a revenue funding. And at Pad Farm, we think it's an Environment Agency project which could attract significant capital funding, and I think different bits of land will have different strategies. So just in terms of where that's got us to, we're working with Surrey Wildlife Trust, hence our really strong connection with you here today, as leaders of natural capital planning, in particularly in relation to biodiversity net gain developer contributions. That Surrey will be helping us do natural capital plans for the 3 bits of land I've mentioned, creating biodiversity net gain credits. Also, we're in a process with DEFRA on their test and trials to potentially develop from if you go back to the map I showed you, a sort of landscape scale recovery approach with the river systems and working with people like the Knepp Estate to build a bigger, kind of more ambitious vision for the area.
How have you decided on the land management strategy per site, and did you engage the local community on this as well?
Designing with humans in mind is inevitably what's needed, and certainly in some sites. On New Salts Farm, which is a wetland area, floodplain, and low-grade arable land, we're pretty clear that a big chunk of it is changing a engineered flood culvert into a meandering stream. But we're actually going to be working with the Rivers Trust, who have done a similar restoration project elsewhere in our area, and they are the ideal partners to be the leaders in community engagement and project development. So in that case, we'll sit back somewhat as landowner and let the Rivers Trust develop and the Wildlife Trust develop relationships with the community, and they will probably be the fronting the community engagement there. Similarly at Pad Farm, at the moment we're engaging with some of the key interest groups such as the ornithological societies, and taking them on a journey, and just simply, I think what's important is to be straightforward with people about, we're pretty clear what we're going to do here. We want to go, conversations with the community is, this is what we would like to do. We don't know whether we can afford it, but we certainly want to engage with you about that space, and go on the journey together in terms of what could it become, and how could you be involved. So the council wants to engage with the community with open questions about how this might play out, rather than have a plan and consult on it.
We believe the only way to help nature recover is actually in collaboration with others. So this year we have been developing an Empowering Communities project. Now we know there's so many people within our communities already doing fantastic work. So the main purpose of this project is to support local people to take action for their environment. We will be mainly focusing in and around our biodiversity opportunity areas, or BOAs as we call them. And you can see these here. So in green in the centre is the North Downs, in purple in the west of the county is the Thames Basin Heath, and in blue in the east of the county is the Holmesdale wetland. So our core objective is to connect habitats and to support nature to thrive. And we can do this by creating and linking wildlife friendly habitats in our community spaces, our gardens, our schools, our parishes, our towns and our countryside. And we understand that there's considerable talent within our communities. So we actually want to create solutions together with local people. And we want to ensure people are empowered and trained to take action themselves, so it's more sustainable in the long term. And we also want to create a network between groups, so there's the opportunity to learn from each other and share experience. And I thought it would be useful for you to visually see where the groups are located that we've already connected with. And on the map here, you can see the different pins that represent the different groups. So the main groups I've connected with are Rosamond Community Garden, which are on the edge of Guildford, Guildford Environmental Forum, Norbury Park Volunteers, Effingham Climate Change Group, Farnham Biodiversity Partnership, Greener Betchworth, Brockham Parish Council, Friends of Shalford, and there's a few other groups there as well.
We came together with a couple of main aims. Firstly, to try and create a formal document and plan for biodiversity in support of the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan. A number of us who'd been engaged with helping the town council pull together the neighbourhood plan and put in as much about biodiversity as we could in there, and also followed up with the Farnham design statement. And secondly, to create more informal networking and activity among existing groups across the local community. And we formed a little community interest company to coordinate the activities of the partnership and to be answerable to them for the core plan. But more broadly, what we've tried to do is engage with the very wide range of existing groups across Farnham. Some of those, like the Bishop's Meadow Trust, like the Tice's Meadow Bird Group, are already very actively looking after pieces of land in the community. We've got the other stakeholders, the Town Council and the Waverley Borough Council, who are obviously statutory engagees in biodiversity these days, but they're also landowners in the community. And then, as you can see, there's a range of other interested groups, some with a direct biodiversity interest, but others like the Rotary Club and the Farnham Society, who are just beginning to sort of create more awareness amongst their members that this is an important feature within the Farnham community. We've developed our first proper working draft of the Biodiversity Action Plan, which we've issued to our partners in April, which consists of an overall high-level plan and then underlying plans for our first action areas. So species plans for hedgehogs, swifts and stag beetles, all of which are quite iconic in our area. And last on there, but very important, we've been working with the Town Council to develop a biodiversity policy statement for the Town Council. And that ties the sort of community developed biodiversity action plan into core policy from the Town Council. So that's a really great step for us. The other part of our knowledge base that we're developing is mapping sites of interest across the area. These might be existing sites that are known for their biodiversity, or they could be tracts of land where there's an opportunity to improve biodiversity, and developing our knowledge of those sites and how we can move those forward with landowners. As a community, we've still got ongoing challenges. Farnham is a great place for tidiness. We've featured heavily in Britain in Bloom over the years, and people will always want smart flower beds and prettiness, and we have to make sure that we work with that community to show how it can be biodiverse as well. There's still major developments going on in Farnham, and there's a major infrastructure programme being put forward by Surrey County Council, where we're very concerned that it may be become a road building programme, and we need to address the biodiversity. On the flip side, we really, as I say, want to look at the urban biodiversity opportunities, as Claire mentioned, joining up some of the quite small initiatives. Things like gardens is a major initiative for us, but the Waverley spaces, and how we can move forward perhaps with the planners in getting better biodiversity considerations into new developments. As a core team, some of the things that we're looking at is developing some more sort of concrete strategy with Waverley on the green spaces, and looking at the river corridor, which is a very important feature of the town for us, with local partners and with the Way Landscape Partnership.
Land Management 2 will be organising some interviews with you, the audience, to gain your perspectives and insights on Surrey's natural environment. With this context, we will then bring together all stakeholders into roundtable conversations and workshops to develop an aligned strategy and co-create projects which regenerate Surrey's natural and farmed environments. We'll keep in touch through the Regenerative Surrey newsletter. You can sign up for that through the Land Management website.
Please join the Regenerative Surrey online community. It's your chance to have your say both on what you heard on this webinar and continue the conversations, but also outline what you would like to get out of this.